Niccolò Machiavelli is one of the most polarizing figures in history, a man who wrote in defense of the indefensible. His cold, calculating formula for the pursuit and maintenance of power has divided and even inspired many generations of readers. While much attention has been focused on his writing, comparably little has been said about his life or his influences. In order to truly understand Machiavelli and answer the many questions that surround his controversial beliefs, we must examine his early years. Machiavelli rose from humble origins to become one of the most powerful men in Renaissance Europe, and his story certainly played an important role in the development of his theory of power. But before we get to that, we need to discuss the greatest influence on his life, the city of Florence. Its history, which he studied carefully, shaped the young Machiavelli. Indeed, much of his writing is best understood as a reflection upon his beloved city. Florence, nestled in the Tuscan region of Italy, is a place that's easy to fall in love with. The natural beauty that surrounds it, as well as the man-made beauty inside of it, are extraordinary. It has been home to some of the most famous artists and thinkers in history, including Dante, Michelangelo, Galileo, Raphael, and Leonardo da Vinci. In spite of its beauty and grand intellectual reputation, the city was historically marred by intense struggles for power. Florence first shows up in the written record in 59 BC. It was founded by the Romans as a village for military veterans to live in. The Romans built a bridge over the Arno River and began utilizing the city as an important trade hub to connect the ports on both sides of the Italian peninsula. As the previously unified Roman Empire began to collapse, the city frequently switched hands between the dominion of the Ostrogoths and the Byzantines. By the 8th century, Florence had been absorbed into the Kingdom of Italy, a constituency kingdom of the empire founded by Charlemagne. This arrangement lasted until the 12th century, when the Florentines decided that they were sick of being ruled over by foreigners and sought national self-determination. Their rebellion was successful, and the Republic of Florence was established. The system of government was quite unique, and at least somewhat democratic. The city was controlled by the Signoria, which was a council composed of 9 members. Florence was dominated by a highly organized guild system, in which most merchants and artisans belonged to a guild that governed their particular craft or area of business. The guilds both regulated their respective trades and provided benefits and protections to their members. 8 of the 9 members of the governing council of Florence were selected at random from lists of eligible guild members. The 9th member, who would be the head of government and leader of the military, was directly elected by the guild members. In order to prevent any individual or organization from gaining too much power, there were strict term limits. One could only be a member of the government for a mere 2 months. The fact that the leaders of the city were determined by a lottery system that drafted citizens at random into important political roles, coupled with the frequent rotation of these leaders, meant that it was critical for the average Florentine citizen to be well educated and capable of fulfilling their duties, should they be called to it. Hence, the city invested enormous resources into its education system, producing one of the most well-educated societies in the region. It is likely for this reason that Florence prospered both economically and intellectually, becoming one of the foremost hubs of commerce and culture in Europe. Unfortunately for Florence, their innovative political system was eventually subsumed by factionalism and scheming. Divisions emerged regarding how accepting Florence should be of papal edicts and what the political status of the local aristocracy should be. Members of an unfavored faction were banned from being eligible for government positions. This led to a series of factional back and forths that gradually eroded democracy. Popular discontent grew as well. Florence's guild system was delineated between the 7 major guilds and the 14 minor guilds. Minor guilds received significantly less representation in government than the majors, and thus the laws tended to be more favorable to members of the dominant guilds. Moreover, a large segment of the population belonged to no guilds, and thus received 0 representation and almost nothing in the form of legal protections. In the late 14th century, the minor guilds pushed for stronger political representation. Fearful that the minor guilds could ally themselves with the non-gilded masses, the aristocratic elite offered concessions to them. In exchange for increased political power, the minor guilds agreed to keep the ungilded out of their ranks. They accomplished this by quadrupling the entrance fee necessary to join a guild. Now, with their incentives largely aligned, the aristocrats and the middle-class professionals decided to raise taxes on the ungilded laborers while keeping taxes relatively low on themselves. The ungilded became infuriated with the government and launched a revolt in 1378. This was a critical event in the history of Florence, and one that helped shape the thinking of Machiavelli. The revolt began after attempted negotiations between the guilds and the ungilded broke down. The masses launched a revolution and overthrew the government, installing a lowly wool merchant named Michel de Lando as the ruler of the city. The reforms of this new government were not particularly radical. They simply created 3 new guilds that ensured that nearly every male citizen in the city belonged to a guild, and thus had political representation as well as legal protections. They allowed the previous guilds and the broader aristocratic elite to continue to exist and be represented in government. The leader of the revolt, de Lando, wanted to ensure that the new government was stable and that the society did not descend into chaos, and thus decided to leave the old elite intact, although he did allow for their political power to be substantially diluted by the admittance of thousands of new people into the guilds. Many of the revolutionaries were disgusted with the pragmatism and compromises of de Lando. They wanted much more radical change and eventually organized against him. Fearing for his safety and grip on power, de Lando allied himself with the old elite and crushed the movement he once led. The government became increasingly divided between various factions, and the once powerful and prosperous city appeared weak, disorganized, and governed by incompetent leadership. The city's well-educated population recognized the danger that this state of affairs posed to them, including the growing threat of the city being invaded by an outside power. This fear led the people to vote for the abolition of the new, inclusive guilds, and for the return to power of the old, gilded elite. While these aristocrats were somewhat oppressive, the people largely viewed them as being competent and capable of keeping them safe from outsiders. The government, now determined to prevent the lower classes from ever getting political power again, transitioned Florence's political system from a quasi-democratic one to an authoritarian oligarchy, an oligarchy that would become dominated by one extremely powerful family, the Medici. It is impossible to understand Machiavelli without understanding the Medici, the family that determined the course of his life and his beliefs. The Medici arose in the early 13th century as wealthy textile merchants operating in the countryside north of Florence. Giovanni de' Medici founded the Medici Bank in 1397. Under Giovanni's shrewd leadership, his family's bank became the largest in Europe. His most notable client was the Pope, who gave the Medici a banking monopoly over the Vatican's significant treasury. Giovanni translated his family's enormous wealth into political power, but in a way that was subtle and unlikely to arouse the anger of the common people. He instructed his family members to refrain from wearing flamboyant or distinct outfits, a practice that was widespread among all the other wealthy families in Florence. He did not want the people to view the Medici as elitist or showy. Giovanni also decided to not actively seek office, instead positioning himself so that it would be inevitable that the city would request his leadership one day. Indeed, they did, and he was appointed leader of Florence for the statutory 2-month period. Giovanni earned the trust of the general population by portraying himself as a humble servant of the people who reluctantly fulfilled his leadership duties, in contrast with the power-hungry career politicians. He enacted populist measures, such as the abolition of a poll tax that disproportionately harmed the poor, and he blocked edicts that would have increased the power of the nobility. Giovanni's strategy was somewhat Machiavellian in nature. He convinced the people that he was a virtuous man who was on their side, while simultaneously blocking all the rivals of the Medici from attaining power. His son and successor, Cosimo, doubled down on this approach. He kept a low profile, but used his family's wealth to gain control over nearly every elected official in the country. Cosimo never actually held office, but became the de facto king of Florence. He also sponsored numerous artists and thinkers, further ingratiating himself with the people. He utilized this popularity to mobilize the citizenry against any elite family that threatened his power, and thus firmly entrenched the Medici atop the Florentine oligarchy. Cosimo's son and successor, Piero, was the first Medici ruler to face serious resistance from the people. The populist gimmicks of the Medici were starting to wear thin, and the Florentines began to realize that the family was subverting any pretense of democracy that still existed and replacing it with what was effectively now a hereditary monarchy. Piero successfully defeated an attempted coup early in his tenure, and defeated a second coup later on that was backed by Florence's enemy, Venice. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in 1469, the first year of the reign of Lorenzo de' Medici, the son of Piero, who was later known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. Machiavelli's family had somewhat illustrious roots, with several of his ancestors having been prominent Florentine politicians, but the connections were too distant and indirect for Niccolò to lay claim to any sort of prestige or nobility by virtue of his birth. Niccolò's father, Bernardo, was a lawyer. While this was a well-regarded profession, he was locked out of the Lawyers' Guild due to the heavy debts he was in. We don't know a lot about the circumstances of Niccolò's childhood, although we can guess that he enjoyed middle-class comforts, but probably lacked connections with the upper class due to his father's situation. When Niccolò was only 9 years old, one of the most significant events in Florence's history occurred. The Pazzi Conspiracy was an attempt to overthrow the Medici by assassinating all of the most powerful members of the family on the same day. The seeds for this event were laid in 1471, when Francesco della Rovere was made the new pope. He came from a poor family, and used his newfound power to make every member of his entire extended family wealthy by appointing them to important roles in the Vatican and by persuading the various rulers of Italy to bestow noble titles upon them. The Medici refused to go along with this, and blocked the Pope from appointing his allies and family members to important Catholic posts located within the Florentine Republic. The most significant rift between the Pope and the Medici occurred when the Pope attempted to purchase the town of Imola, a holding of Milan that occupied an important position along the main trade route between Florence and Venice. Lorenzo de' Medici had already arranged to purchase this town for Florence, but Milan changed their mind after the Pope made a better offer that included a beneficial marriage for the Duke of Milan's daughter. The Medici were furious, and refused to allow their bank to finance the deal. The Pope responded by ending the special relationship between the Vatican and the Medici Bank, and making the Pazzi, a rival Florentine dynasty, the Vatican's bankers. The Pazzi, now very wealthy from their dealings with the Pope, saw an opportunity to overthrow the Medici and become the dominant family in Florence. They approached the Pope, who also hated the Medici, with a plan to assassinate the leaders of the family. The Pope could not officially condone such killing, but he made it clear that he would smile upon the action, and would recognize the Pazzi as the legitimate rulers of Florence if their plot was successful. On April 26, 1478, several members of the Pazzi family and their co-conspirators attacked Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano at the Duomo in Florence. Giuliano was killed, but Lorenzo managed to escape after being wounded. Simultaneous to the attack in the Duomo, the Pazzi attempted to overtake the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of government, but were repelled by Medici forces. The Pazzi had assumed that the people of Florence would rise up with them, but instead they largely sided with the Medici. The coup had failed. The subsequent campaign of vengeance unleashed by the Medici on their enemies was so extreme that it left an indelible mark on both the city of Florence and a young Machiavelli. Anyone who was even remotely connected to the conspiracy was publicly executed, 83 people in total. The Pazzi family was systematically destroyed. Their assets were seized. Every member was either executed or exiled, and their very name was banned in Florence. The Medici, now emboldened and facing little rivalry, enacted a series of reforms that greatly increased their own power. Machiavelli experienced all of this as a student under the tutelage of Paolo da Ronciglione, who taught him Latin, grammar, and rhetoric. Ronciglione was one of the most renowned teachers in Florence at the time, and his tutoring would have been difficult to attain. Given the lack of nobility and wealth in Machiavelli's family, it can be assumed that Niccolò received such a great education as a result of his own merits, and was likely a very gifted student. After his initial tutoring, it is believed that Machiavelli enrolled at the University of Florence. During these college years, another critical event in the city's history began to unfold, which he would later write about in The Prince. This is the second part in a series I am doing about Machiavelli. We have just begun to scratch the surface of his life and ideas. In subsequent videos, I plan on discussing how Machiavelli acquired enormous power over a short period of time, his success as a strategist, and his rapid downfall thereafter. By learning about the tumultuous events of his life and the world around him, we can deconstruct his ideas more clearly. We can begin to answer some of the questions surrounding him, including the one most interesting to me. Was Machiavelli actually being serious, or was his writing satirical? If this topic sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing, and leave a comment below if you have any thoughts on the subject. I need 1,000 subscribers for YouTube to monetize this channel, so if you click that button, it would mean a lot to me. Also, please hit the thumbs up button, as this helps with the algorithm. If you have not yet watched the first part of this series, where I give an overview of Machiavelli's beliefs and the various defenses and criticisms of them, you can watch that here.